Welcome to the latest chapter in our series, exploring the distinctive communities whose histories and culture have contributed important pieces to the mosaic we call Santa Monica. Tonight's program will focus on another kind of community, that of refugees, brought together not by choice, but survival and freedom of expression. As we are now witnessing the fallout of the war in Ukraine, where over 4 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their country, we reflect on the diaspora of Jewish and anti-fascist artists and intellectuals who fled Hitler's treachery leading up to World War II. In her presentation, our speaker, Donna Rifkind, will reference her book, The Sun and Her Stars, about screenwriter Salka Viertel, whose uncompromising conviction and generosity emboldened her to provide shelter and creative cultivation for this community of emigres. Viertel's community efforts to bring them together for weekly salons extended to them a sense of safety, peace, and hope. Her home on Mayberry Road, on the rim of Santa Monica Canyon overlooking the sea, became a shelter, a place of cordial assistance, a kind of oasis in the ever-expanding desert, her husband, Viertel, once said. And today, the house stands as an homage to the writers, musicians, and filmmakers Viertel brought together and nourished at her Sunday night suppers. As Rifkind will explain, on the other side of the canyon, Lion Feuchtwanger's Villa Aurora and the Thomas Mann house nearby also provided artistic refuge for the exiled community. These residents now serve as transatlantic bridge builders, promoting intercultural exchange and enabling dialogue between the arts community and Los Angeles resident artists from Europe and beyond. Rifkind is a journalist and reviewer whose work often appears in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times Book Review and other publications. In 2006, she was a finalist for the Nora Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing for the National Book Critics Circle Award. This book, The Sun and Her Stars, is her first. Before I introduce Donna, I'd like to remind you in the audience that you have an opportunity to ask questions anytime during the program by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In addition, if you'd like more information about Donna's book, just enter the chat box also at the bottom of your screen and you'll find out everything you need to know. And now, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Donna Rifkind.
Thank you, Libby, for that wonderful introduction. It's a privilege to be here. I know that Santa Monicans are justifiably very proud and very engaged in their history. And so I'm delighted to be able to spend a little bit of time with you today talking about it. And as Libby pointed out, it is impossible to see these images of Ukrainian refugees and not think about the parallels between that and other forced human migrations, including the one that I'm going to talk about today in the 1930s and 1940s. I have a little bit of a big story to tell, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. But if anyone has any comments or questions about it in the chat, in the Q&A section, let's for sure discuss that. I would like that. It's estimated that about 10,000 German-speaking immigrants settled in the greater Los Angeles area in the decade after 1933. And there's a story that I really like that sort of shows the prevalence of this German-speaking population here. And it's about the film director Otto Preminger. If we could see that slide. Preminger found himself in a casino on Sunset Boulevard called the Clover Club that was very popular with immigrants. And he was at the roulette table one night. And he was one of the only non-Hungarian speakers at the roulette table. And the Hungarian language is really starting to get on his nerves. So he slammed his fist down on the green felt of the table and he shouted, "Guys, you're in America, speak German." And so many of those emigres, including Preminger himself, if we could go to the next slide, were huge superstars in European arts and culture. It's almost impossible to find a parallel in today's celebrity culture of exactly how famous they were. And two of them still have houses that are standing today in the Pacific Palisades, the Villa Aurora, which was owned by the novelist Lion Feuchtwanger, and Thomas Mann's house on San Remo Drive. Today, both are owned by the German government, and their mission is to build bridges between American and German culture and to promote democracy around the world. They do a very good job, I think, doing both of those. And in the next slide, I'll show a couple more houses that are still standing today. That is Bertelsbrecht's house that is on 26th Street in Santa Monica, and that is Salka Viertel's house, who was a very good friend of Brecht. She had known him before both of them came to Los Angeles and Berlin. And when Brecht came later as a refugee, he was quite comforted by coming to Salka's house and reuniting with her in Los Angeles. If we could go to the next slide, please. A little bit of background about Salka Feartel. She was a former actress who became a screenwriter. She was born in 1889 in a little town in what was then known as Galicia on the fringe of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a little town called Sambor. Her family were German-speaking Jews, and I had never heard anything about Salka Viertel. I'm an LA native, and when I was growing up here, the anti-fascist emigration was not taught in school, nor were the biographies of any of the people involved in it. But as an adult, I went to the library and I found a memoir that she had written, which was long out of print at the time, called The Kindness of Strangers. And like many people who read this memoir, I fell completely in love with her. She is such a charismatic spirit, an optimistic and dynamic personality. And I wanted to know so much more about her, and there wasn't really any more to find out, either about her time as a screenwriter for MGM during the Hollywood's golden age, or her activities on behalf of refugees. So I realized that I was going to have to write the book that I would myself have wanted to read. And I thought I was going to write a little local book about Hollywood, and I could go to some of the nearby archives. But in fact, I learned that most local history has global ramifications, and that certainly was the case here. I ended up going to Switzerland, to Germany, and to odd pockets of the US in order to try to uncover Salka's story. If we could go to the next slide. This is a photo of Salka Feartel in the 1940s when she herself was in her early 50s. This is on the back porch of her house on Mayberry Road in the Santa Monica Canyon. And that's her dog, Prince, who is very loyal to Salka, but who bit everybody who came to the house, including Greta Garbo. There were lots of other dogs in the Feartel household. There was a very bad-tempered dachshund named Frida, who only liked Bertolt and was nasty to everybody else. And there was an Old English sheepdog who would ride in the passenger seat of Salka's convertible and put his paw on her shoulder as she careened around the Santa Monica Canyon way too fast. The dogs were all present at Salka's Sunday parties, as were her 3 children, and lots and lots and lots of people at these parties, which actually Salka never called salons. She called them tea parties, or she called them supper parties. Salka would introduce a lot of these European superstars, the novelist Franz Werfel, the avant-garde composer Arnold Schoenberg. If we could go to the next slide, to all sorts of Hollywood celebrities who were her close friends, including Charlie Chaplin, the director John Huston, Christopher Isherwood. The list really goes on and on. And so the next slide, I want to show you what the house looked like in the 1930s and the 1940s. And give you an idea of how an emigre would experience a Sunday gathering at Salka's house. So, for example, let's use Ernst Toch, who was a Viennese composer, and let's say it's the summer of 1936. Next slide, please. Ernst Toch was both a serious classical composer. He ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1956, and a writer of film music for dozens of classic Hollywood pictures. He's not quite as well known as other emigres like Eric Korngold or Franz Waxman, but he himself was quite prodigious as a film composer. He knew the Feartels because he had written music for Salka's husband Bertold, who was a director who had a picture called Little Friend that was filmed in London, and the Bertold Feartel had met Toch there. And so if Toch were to enter that red door in front of Salka's house, he would see a piano and bookshelves and lots of furniture that was not very fancy that Salka probably got in the thrift shops in Glendale where the studios bought their props. There would be music on the phonograph. There would be the smell of Salka's apple cake in the oven. The three boys, the Feartel boys, would be running around on their way to the beach. The dogs would be milling around. And there would be this great crowd of people. And it had a very sort of strong air of improvisation. It was a casual, but there were certain European conventions. For example, the children had to bow to guests they were being introduced to. So it was this odd combination of, European continental sophistication and California kind of casualness. So if we could go to the next slide, let's say Salka wanted to introduce Ernst Toch to her wide web of connections. She might see Billy Wilder, who we see in this photo in a corner, or she might see Johnny Weissmuller, who was the star of the very popular Tarzan movies at the time, in another. Like Billy Wilder, Ernst Toch was forced to flee Europe because he was Jewish. He was about to mount an opera of his in Cologne in 1933 when a bunch of brown shirts stormed into the hall and snatched the baton out of the conductor's hand. And shortly after that, in a music magazine called Die Musik, there were caricatures of Toch and of other Jewish composers with these sort of awful, hook-nosed, anti-Semitic caricatures, and a quotation from Hitler that said, "The Jew has no ability to create culture." So Toch was lucky enough to leave Europe, and he landed in LA with the help of George Gershwin and several other lucky connections. Also, like Billy Wilder, Toch was lucky to have gone into exile at all and to work for the movies, because that would ensure that he got a paycheck and would not be what the US government called a public charge. He could show that he could support himself in America. Toch had over 64 cousins in Europe who would not be as fortunate as he was. If we could go to the next slide, I just want to show a picture of what Santa Monica Canyon looked like in the 1920s, a bit before Salka Viertel arrived. She came in 1928. This is a bit before that. And as you can see, there was really not much there. There was maybe a pharmacy and I think a little grocery store. If Salka wanted to do any major grocery shopping, she would have to go downtown to the Grand Central Market or maybe to Beverly Hills. But she fell in love with Santa Monica the minute she saw it. And the men at the studio where her husband had gotten a job were horrified that she would want to live at the beach. They thought it was incredibly toxic. The air there was bad. She would get gout. She would get bronchitis. In fact, Irving Thalberg, who was the head of production at MGM at the time, did have a house at the beach, but he had double paned windows to block out the ocean air because it was thought to be so unhealthful. We could go to the next photo. Salka did not believe the studio employees who told her that. She immediately fell in love with the pier, with the ballroom at the pier, with the bohemianism of the canyon. And this photo, I think, is wonderful, and it gives you a very good view of what the canyon and the bay looked like from the bottom of Mayberry Road at Salka's street. Salka lived there for 25 years and persuaded many of her friends to live in the same neighborhood. The house was always full of guests and full of house guests for people who needed an extra bed. And they were always made to feel that it was their own home, not just Salka's home, but theirs as well. If we could go to the next slide, to give an idea of how Salka Viertel found herself in a position to help refugees in Los Angeles. She had been an actress in the early 20s in Europe. This is a picture of her as an actress in Max Reinhardt's theaters. He had a chain of theaters all throughout the great European capitals. And Salka herself played many leading roles in all kinds of cities in Vienna and Dusseldorf and Munich and Dresden. And she met scores of artists who she would later be reunited with in Los Angeles, including Brecht, as I mentioned, and Ernst Lubitsch and Arnold Schoenberg. And through her husband, Bertold Feartel, she also met lots of Viennese cafe society. If we could go to the next slide, here's a picture of Bertold. He and Salka were married in 1918 in a synagogue. Bertold himself also came from a Jewish family. And they pretty quickly had 3 sons. Hans, who was the eldest, who became an academic and a translator of the works of Bertolt Brecht, as well as a close collaborator with the linguist Noam Chomsky. The middle son, Peter, became a very successful screenwriter and novelist who was close friends with Ernest Hemingway and the Spanish bullfighter Dominguín. And Tom, the youngest, worked for social services for the city of Los Angeles and was a poet, just like his father. And if we could go to the next slide. So Bertold was offered a job from Fox Film Studios to come to California in 1928 to be the writer for the films of the German director W Murnau. He had a lot of early success there as Murnau's writer and then became a director for Fox and then for Paramount. Salka herself realized that her acting days were numbered. She was already 40 years old. And then, as now, there were not a lot of roles for older women. And so to kind of keep herself busy, she became a de facto manager for both Murnau and for Sergei Eisenstein, the great Soviet director who we see in this photo, as both Murnau and Eisenstein tried to make independent films, Murnau in Tahiti and Eisenstein in Mexico. Both projects went poorly, although Salka did her best to advocate for them in the studio and to advise them as she saw the daily rushes. Eisenstein never completed a picture in the US while he was here. But when he went back to the Soviet Union, he sent this photo to Salka thanking her and saying that this was the only film he had managed to make in America. If we could go to the next slide, Salka did manage to have a few small roles in some pictures, both silent and when sound came in. This is Salka and Greta Garbo in the 1930 German language edition of Anna Christie. It was Greta Garbo's favorite of all of her performances and the one in which famously in the advertising slogan, Garbo talks. Garbo and Salka had met at a party at Ernst Lubitsch's house in 1929. Greta Garbo was then at the height of her fame and her beauty. And they developed a very deep friendship that lasted throughout all their Hollywood years and became very close collaborators in the Hollywood studio system. Garbo understood that Salka was sort of mourning the end of her acting career, and she suggested that she give a try at writing, at screenwriting. And so she asked her to write a story about Queen Christina, the 17th century Swedish monarch. Garbo herself was an emigre from Sweden, and she greatly admired Queen Christina. So Salka did write that treatment and was hired by Irving Thalberg at MGM, which launched a quite successful second career for her as one of Greta Garbo's principal screenwriters. So if we could go to the next slide, this is the very famous final shot of the 1933 film Queen Christina, where the queen has abdicated her throne and is going off into exile. And Garbo asked the director, Ruben Mamoulian, what she should think about during the scene as she stares out into the ocean. And Mamoulian says, your mind should be a blank. You should think about nothing so that the audience can project their emotions onto you. But I think actually that Garbo may have been tapping into emotions she might have felt when leaving Sweden as a teenager. And then when she reached LA, having difficulty adjusting to life in America. These are emotions every immigrant feels. And it's quite possible that that's what she was kind of channeling there. I think that the film Queen Christina is an example of the cross-pollination of a great European subject and of American filmmaking technology, and kind of shows that they worked as a hybrid very well together. If we could go to the next, these are all of Salka's credits for Hollywood films beyond Queen Christina. The first three are Greta Garbo vehicles that she wrote for MGM. That last one, Two-Faced Woman, was the last film Greta Garbo ever made. It premiered in 1941 as the US was entering World War II and closing off the European markets. And although Garbo did not intend to retire at that time, she was only 36, she was a huge, huge star. She never managed to make another movie for various reasons. And that last film that was not a Garbo vehicle, Salka wrote for Warner Brothers, called Deep Valley. She had become an American citizen in 1939, and now by 1947, her writing has evolved quite far from her Queen Christina days. She was no longer explaining Europe to Americans as she had in her earlier films. Now she herself is a Californian, explaining post-war evolution of the West to those same American audiences. If we could go to the next slide, I'm going to switch gears here and talk a little bit about Lion Feuchtwanger, who, like many of the LA exiles, had spent his last time in Europe in the south of France. He had migrated to the south of France, hoping to find safety there, and lived in a little fishing village called Sannery-sur-Mer. This is his villa in Sannery, his house, overlooking the ocean. And life was pretty good in Sannery until it wasn't, and Feuchtwanger was rounded up and sent to an internment camp at Les Milles. He was actually sent there twice. He had rebuilt a library in Sannery after the Nazis had completely destroyed his substantial library in Berlin, stolen his house and all of his possessions, and froze his bank account. So he fled to Sannery along with many other German refugees, and until the Nazis took over France, and things became very perilous there as well. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that's Lion Feuchtwanger and his wife Marta in front of his library in Sannery, his rebuilt library. This was in 1936. And Feuchtwanger understood very well the symbolic power of books, not just what was in books, but what books meant. And there were reasons that the Nazis piled books on bonfires in order to, vilify the people who had written them, the Jews and anti-fascists who had written them. And he vowed that, everywhere that he would find a refuge, he would rebuild a library. So this is his insanity. He had written a novel that I really recommend called The Opermons. You can find it in the library, and it was written in 1933, just as Hitler was taking power. It's about a German Jewish family in Berlin, and it is incredibly prescient about everything that was going to happen. There was no way that Feuchtwanger would even know, but he somehow was able to sort of guess what would happen. It's a very eerie book to read right now. Marta, his wife herself, was also interned in a concentration camp in 1939 at the base of the Pyrenees. If we go to the next slide, amazingly, there's a photograph of Lion Feuchtwanger in Les Milles. That's him in the center behind the barbed wire. This was a brickworks camp where the sanitation was terrible. The food and water were very sparse. And the brick dust that was kicked up from the making of the bricks made him cough up blood. Feuchtwanger was sent from there to a military camp outside of Nîmes, where his wife planned a quite successful escape for him. And it sounds kind of comical now, but probably wasn't then. She disguised him as an elderly English woman and sort of spirited him into a limousine, and he was able to escape. And from there, the Feuchtwangers made it to Marseille, where they then managed to escape through Spain, Portugal, and found a steamship for America, arriving in Los Angeles in 1940. And the next slide, here we see Marta on the patio at the Villa Aurora in the house that they built, where they were hosts to fellow refugees in much the same way that Salka Viertel was. During the war, there was a curfew for German citizens. They were known as enemy aliens, and they had to be off the streets by 8 o'clock at night. And you could not, if you were somewhere, you had to stay there overnight. So many times there would be people at their house who would stay over and wait for the news bulletins that came on at midnight on the radio. And during the time that they were waiting for those bulletins, they would play charades. And they also had a dartboard painted with an image of Adolf Hitler that they very enthusiastically threw darts at. You can still see that dartboard at the Villa Aurora if you go there for a tour today. And I think for Marta here in this picture, who looks very peaceful, life took on a kind of surreal calm and a warmth, like a seaside holiday in Pacific Palisades, which must have been a very strange feeling while all of Europe was being destroyed. Here they were in this sort of paradise. Franz Werfel had said that the Riviera is just trash compared to this. They just were overjoyed at how beautiful it was here. The Feuchtwangers rebuilt their library once again, and you can see many of those books if you go to the Villa Aurora, or if you go to USC, to the Feuchtwanger Memorial Library. His books are still there. And let's go to the next slide. I want to talk about the European Film Fund a bit. This was a grassroots movement in Hollywood, which worked in coordination with the Emergency Rescue Committee. They raised money among studio employees to secure affidavits, visas, and travel support for refugees like Lion Feuchtwanger. Salka Viertel herself was not a founding member, but she was a very active one behind the scenes. She was constantly petitioning studio executives and actors and directors to get them to provide affidavits and checks. And there isn't much of a paper trail for the European Film Fund because it had to operate quite under the radar. Some of what it was doing was illegal. But this is a record of contributions from studio employees for that month. You know, they would give everything they could, a portion of their paycheck, in order to, you know, do what they could on behalf of refugees. And Salka herself was able to personally persuade people like Dorothy Parker, Herman Mankiewicz, Donald Ogden Stewart, and tons of others to sponsor refugees at considerable risk to them, because their bank accounts were on the line. If those refugees could not, you know, make it in America, it was up to their sponsors to provide the financial assistance that they needed. Fortunately, none of them ever had to do that, the ones that Salka sponsored. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about Bertolt Brecht, who caught the last boat out of Vladivostok in 1941 with help from the emigre director William Dieterle and Lion Feuchtwanger, his very good friend. And he was one of the last refugees to make it to Los Angeles before the doors closed completely on anyone trying to escape Europe. Brecht himself was not beloved by many of his fellow emigres in Los Angeles, including Thomas Mann, but Salka Feartel and he were always quite close. And Salka, in order to try to improve his financial situation, collaborated with Brecht on a failed screenplay about a modern day Joan of Arc. It didn't go anywhere, but they had fun doing it. Brecht also, in Salka's living room, met and forged a very close friendship with the English actor Charles Laughton. Neither one spoke the other's language, but they both spoke French, and so they were able to communicate. And Brecht would go to Laughton's incredible garden overlooking in Pacific Palisades, which overlooked the sea, and he wrote an incredible poem about that garden called, kind of ironically, Garden in Progress, because the garden itself, because of erosion, was sort of sliding down the hill into the sea, where Brecht would be looking at all of the warships that were guarding the bay at the time. It's a wonderful poem. And Brecht and Laughton also collaborated on a version of Brecht's play Galileo, which they put on in 1947 at the Coronet Theater, a theater that still exists today. And it was all the emigres. It was sort of the, you know, including Charlie Chaplin and all sorts of other people, sort of star-studded, you know, premiere for this play when it happened. I want to give a little sense of the varying fortunes in America of some of these emigres. If we go to the next slide, here is Thomas Mann and his brother Heinrich Mann, both very good friends of Salka Viertel's. Salka gave a 70th birthday party for Heinrich Mann in May of 1941. And it was attended by most of the sort of superstar Europeans who were in Los Angeles at the time. The brothers gave speeches to each other, which went on for quite a long time while Salka's roast beef grew very cold. But it was otherwise a great success, that birthday party. So Thomas Mann, of course, was an incredibly internationally famous writer who had won the Nobel Prize. His time in America was full of honorary, you know, awards and all kinds of, you know, celebrations of his celebrity. He spent time at the White House. He had international sales that were quite robust, allowed him to build a very fancy house. His brother Heinrich, who had been as popular as Thomas Mann as a novelist in Germany, did not have his works translated throughout the world, became a little bit of an unknown. He had been given a year-long contract at Warner Brothers just so that he would not be considered a public charge in America, but he really had no idea what to do with himself there, and just sort of wander around the studio And after that year-long contract gave out, he was forced to rely on handouts from the European Film Fund and from Thomas Mann, really struggled in America. So while people like Lion Feuchtwanger and Thomas Mann prospered, most other emigres like Heinrich Mann in Los Angeles did not. Especially if we go to the next slide, when the late 1940s rolled around and the House Un-American Activities Committee started its investigations in Hollywood. Salka Feartel was not a communist and never had been, but she associated with lots of them. And the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, one of her refugee organizations that she was very active in, was considered a communist front. Salka was questioned by FBI agents. She had an extensive FBI file. Her phone was tapped, her mail was opened. And this is a special issue of the Screenwriters Guild magazine. It's called The Screenwriter. It came out in December of 1947 to protest this repression in the film industry. And Salka Viertel wrote in this edition an impassioned personal essay where she warned Americans not to follow the path toward authoritarianism that had just destroyed Europe. And she was not exaggerating when she said, you know, that her experience through 2 world wars and the mourning of her dear ones had affected her so deeply. Her own youngest brother was murdered by the Nazis in Poland. All of her friends in Los Angeles were suffering terrible losses. 3/4 of Billy Wilder's family was killed in Auschwitz, including his mother. And at least half of those 60+ cousins of Ernst Toch's died in Europe. And in America itself, it did seem as if the winds of fascism were following the emigres to the US. If we can go to the next slide, this is Hanseisler, who was a composer and collaborator with Bertelsbrecht, whom HUAC had made an example of during the 1947 investigation. Salka Viertel spearheaded fundraising campaigns to try to help Hanseisler, but the hearings were disastrous for him. And he was forced to leave the country and to assign a declaration that he and his wife would never return. And Eisler wrote this sort of poignant, declaration that you can read here, that he said he was proud of being driven out of Europe, but I feel heartbroken over being driven out of this beautiful country in this ridiculous way. If we could go to the next slide, Salka herself never testified for under a HUAC and was not herself blacklisted. I don't think she was an important enough figure for them to be able to make an example of, but I think it was more like good old sexism and ageism that marked the end of her Hollywood career. Greta Garbo was no longer acting. The studios really didn't have much use for her. And I think a lot of them used the HUAC hearings as an excuse to get rid of people who they found, that weren't going to make a lot of money for them. So Salka found herself unable to make the payments on her house on Mayberry Road. She herself, who had been so active in the European Film Fund, was forced to take handouts from the European Film Fund herself. She sold her house in 1953 and she moved to the ski town of Klosters, where her son Peter had moved with his second wife, the actress Deborah Carr. And it was here that she wrote her wonderful memoir, The Kindness of Strangers, which is not only a guide to understanding Hollywood history, but I think really one of the best 20th century autobiographies. It had been long out of print, but it was reissued, fortunately, in 2019 by New York Review Classics. So it is available to read if anyone is interested. Salka died in Klosters in 1978 at age 89, but she never stopped missing her house in Santa Monica, which she called a port of entry and home for so many. So thanks for watching, everyone. And now I'd like to hand it back to Libby so we can talk about any questions or comments you might have.
Well, thank you, Donna. A lot to cover, a lot of interesting lore on Hollywood, and certainly the important role that Salka contributed. One question is that we wonder what the legacy of these artists and intellectuals is. Are we, is there a body of work that is still important? Did it change the culture in a way that that perhaps was different before they came?
Well, I think it certainly changed film culture. I think they were the emigres were the ones who introduced the elements of noir to Hollywood films. It really didn't exist before. They were using basically German expressionist lighting and calling it noir. And a lot of the times in Europe, they would light things this way because it was cheaper. But they found in Hollywood that it produced these fantastic effects, which also became part of LA culture and LA lore. You know, when we call things noir and we walk down certain streets, I mean, that has really affected us deeply. In other ways, though, I'd have to say that people like Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht were untouched, I think, by American culture. They did not write about, Thomas Mann never wrote about his time in America, ever. He really stayed in Germany in his mind, you know, and he went back, he didn't go back to Germany, he went back to Switzerland, which he thought of as a more sanitized version of Germany. And Brecht himself hated, you know, everything about capitalism and American culture and did nothing but complain about it the whole time he was here, and went triumphantly back to East Germany right after, as soon as he could after the war, and, you know, was hailed as a hero. So I can't say that a lot of them were necessarily affected. They were grateful to have the refuge, but I think American culture certainly profited from having these incredible intellectuals and superstars. Music too, absolutely. I mean, it was emigres who started these wonderful music festivals that we still have in Los Angeles, the Ojai Music Festival. Franz Waxman was very involved in starting music festivals. The seriousness of the LA Philharmonic was greatly enhanced by the appearance of many of these musicians who came, and of course film culture, because they brought these wonderful Wagnerian scores to American movies that we had not had before.
Speaking of the Philharmonic, did any of the emigres become principal conductor?
Yes.
Like Sternberg or...
well, Otto Klemperer would be the perfect example.
Yeah.
Yes, he was a greatly beloved conductor and had a wonderful time. Yes, and shaped the Philharmonic in wonderful ways at the Hollywood Bowl. There was also an incredible production of Max Reinhardt's Midsummer Night's Dream that took place in the Hollywood Bowl in the 1930s, that actually a relative of mine who's 103 attended when she was a child and remembers that they came down out of the hills. This was before they had the big band shell, with lighted torches, and used the entire environment of the Hollywood Hills as part of the scene. It was legendary. And Warner Brothers tried to make a version of that, of the Midsummer Night's Dream, based on that occasion. And it's just a terrible movie. If you watch it now, it does not translate at all, sadly, but it must have been really quite an experience.
Another question has to do with the survival of the studios during the Depression. Was somebody like Greta, you know, just the money bags and possibly Marlene Dietrich for the other studio, or was that not too significant?
Well, that's an interesting and complicated question. The studios did suffer during the Depression, not right away, but a lot of them had to cut their losses. MGM was in a little bit of a place by itself. They had a ton of money. And part of the reason was because of Greta Garbo's international sales. So she was by far the highest paid star on the MGM lot. And they would do anything for her. You know, she was the queen in their court because she brought in so much money, and she herself made so much money that when she retired at 36, although she hadn't intended to retire, she was fabulously wealthy. She never needed to work again. But there were others.
Did she stay in the States, or did she go back?
She stayed. She ended up living in New York. I think famously she became a bit of a recluse, but she would walk all over Manhattan every day. That was sort of her primary activity, and people would see her and, you know, try to engage with her. But she was, you know, she always sort of wanted to be alone. She would visit Salka often. She would come to Los Angeles and stay with her. And then when Salka moved to Switzerland, Garbo came every summer and stayed for a while and hiked the hills with Salka and spent a lot of time with her there.
Did Salka star in Brecht's plays in Europe prior to immigrating to the US?
She did not. That's a great question. Salka and Bertolt themselves had an avant-garde theater company of their own, where they did have many stars who then came to the US who were just starting out in this theater company. But it went bankrupt during the hyperinflation period. And that was one of the reasons that Bertolt accepted the job at Fox, because there was no way they could keep going in in Berlin with their theater company, where Salka was the star of most of the shows. But the idea was they were going to come to LA, like many people. They would have 5 years of, restoring their bank account, and then they'd go back to Europe and, reestablish their theater company. Now, of course, that didn't happen because Hitler took over in 1933, and they ended up, having to stay. So they themselves were not really exiles since they had come so early, but they did think of themselves as among the emigre community because they were forced to stay. It wasn't their choice to stay.
Somebody asks, what has become of Salka's house?
That's
I guess she means the Mayberry Roadhouse.
Yes, the Mabery Roadhouse is still standing, thankfully. It was sold to the actor. She sold it to the actor John Houseman, the director, who was a good friend of hers. And he then wanted to sort of keep it in the theater family. So it eventually went to Gordon Davidson, who was his protege, of course, the longtime director of the Center Theater Group. And Gordon and his wife, Judy, lived in it for over 30 years, raised their family there, lived in it much the way Salka did. They had artists and actors staying over in their house all the time. And then pretty recently, they sold it to another couple involved in the film industry who have kept the facade of the house and the red door too. They moved it, but you can still see it from the outside. So it's wonderful that the house has not been torn down and that it still stands. You can drive by.
Mm-hmm. That's good, especially because we have now 3 houses that are saved. We have the Villa Aurora and the Thomas Mann house. That's great.
Yes.
How did Salka meet Greta?
Well, they were at a party at Ernst Lubitsch's house. Salka had been invited with Bertold because a visiting film star was coming from Germany, and someone that they knew. And Salka describes this in her autobiography. It's quite charming. And there she comes upon the young, gorgeous Greta Garbo, and they had this sort of magnetic instant connection. Even though Salka was 16 years older and they didn't seem to have that much in common, they really hit it off. And the next day, Garbo came to Salka's house, and she stayed all afternoon and played with the dogs and, engaged with the children. And they took a long walk on the beach, and that became their pattern. They would walk on the beach every time, every morning that Garbo wasn't filming, and they would talk about acting. And Salka gave Garbo a lot of acting advice and coaching from her time as an actress in the Reinhardt theaters. And many of Garbo's mannerisms are actually from Salka herself.
Can you think of one? It's okay. It's okay.
Not at the moment.
Let me see. Somebody wants to know the name of the Feuchtwanger book that you mentioned. And once we tell people, another audience participant said that they found it on Amazon in English. So what is the name of the book?
Yes, it is available. You can get it in the library where I did, but it is also available on Amazon. It's called the Opermons. It's the name of the family. It's
Is it U or O?
Oppermann.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's see what else we've got here. To sort of round out the conversation, you said that you would like to discuss a little bit about the correspondence between all immigrant groups. And can you highlight a few of the blueprint of, first oppression or war, and then removing all forms of communication, and then the adjustment of immigrants into possibly a new country that will be their country for the rest of their lives?
Sure, I think we need a whole other episode.
All right. Okay, just briefly.
But I will say a little. I do think that adjusting to life in America is the responsibility often of grassroots movements like the European Film Fund and individuals like Salka Viertel, because the U.S. government has never had a coherent immigration policy. It did not have one then, and it does not have one now. It has not decided how it wants to respond to these forced human migrations that happen. I think of it as one long story because it's happening everywhere, not just in Ukraine. And it is as a result of war, but also famine and climate change and all kinds of factors that that force people to leave their homes when their homes are no longer recognizable to them as home, which is what is happening in Ukraine. And when authoritarians take over a country or try to dominate it in the way that Russia is now dominating Ukraine, you know, they don't recognize their country as a place for them, and so they have to leave. So somebody described the Roosevelt administration's attitude toward refugees as sympathy without hospitality. And I think that's very accurate. And in some ways, our government now, although we've agreed to take in refugees, I think that's more of a political move, looks good for the people in charge, but it does not, we've never decided, you know, how we're going to respond to these great mobilizations of human beings. Oftentimes the motivations are racist. You know, we are happy to take people with certain skin colors and less happy to take others. And so that plays into it quite a bit. And as I say, it's a very long discussion, but I think of it as not just history or current events, but like one long timeline of something that's always happening.
Right, thank you. I'm going to finish with these questions with somebody wants to know if there are tours of the Thomas Mann House and the Villa Aurora.
That is a good question. I don't think that there are actual tours, but if you go on the websites for each, they have many events. They had lots on Zoom that are continuing, but they have now started to have also live events again. They're incredibly active. There are certain nights at the Villa Aurora where there's an organ that Marta Feuchtwanger played,
right,
where they play the organ and they show a silent film. It's just magical. Yeah. And so there are opportunities for these live events for you to be able to see what's, you know, what the house looked like at the Villa Aurora, the Thomas Mann House too. Lots and lots of programs about the future of democracy, about how Thomas Mann felt about democracy. And there are lots of visiting artists and writers who come and speak, and each of them have fellows from different parts of Europe and the rest of the world who spend time there and engage with the history and with all the archives. And so sometimes those fellows give programs as well.
Thank you. Well, I think that does it for the questions. I would like to thank you for your wonderful program. And also there's another mosaic this summer talking about another community in Santa Monica. And so look for the news there. And finally, I'd like to remind you that if you haven't contributed, or if you'd like to become a member of the Conservancy, you can certainly look for the chat box or go on the website, santamonicaconservancy.org. So thank you and have a good evening.